In the middle of the Mediterranean Sea lies an island shaped like a triangle, kissed by the winds of Africa, the waves of the Tyrrhenian, and the warmth of the Ionian Sea. This is Sicily, a land of sunburnt hills, fertile valleys, and volcanoes whose ash gave life to the soil, even as their fire threatened to consume it. For thousands of years, sailors have called it the jewel of the sea, and warriors have called it the key to empires. From the first settlers who carved their lives from stone, to the Phoenicians who built trading posts, to the Greeks who raised temples as white as the foam of the surf, Sicily was never just an island. It was a stage where cultures performed their dramas, clashed and blended. Carthaginians, Romans, Arabs, Normans, and Spaniards all left their mark. All claimed Sicily, yet none erased the others. To fall asleep with Sicily's story is to drift into a dream of crossroads of shepherds guiding their flocks under Etna's shadow, of galleys cutting across wine-dark seas, of markets filled with saffron and olive oil, and of knights who brought crusader zeal into the heart of the Mediterranean. It is a tale of beauty and blood, of conquest and coexistence, of rise and fall repeated through centuries. Tonight, we step onto the shores of this island. We listen to the whispers of its olive groves and the distant rumble of its mountains, and we let history unfold like the tide, gentle at first, then rising, carrying us through the ages until sleep overtakes us, as it has overtaken empires before. Long before Sicily became the prize of kings and empires, it was simply an island of forests and fertile plains, waiting for the first people to arrive. Archaeologists tell us that by the Stone Age, small bands of hunters and gatherers had already crossed narrow straits or sailed across calm seas to make their homes here. They left behind tools of flint, shards of pottery, and the bones of animals they hunted. Their lives were fragile, bound to the rhythm of seasons. Yet their presence marked the beginning of Sicily's long human story. These early Sicilians lived in caves carved by wind and water. Places like Adora, near Palermo. On those walls, they painted strange and elegant figures, dancing in circles, arms raised toward the sky. Was it ritual, or was it play? No one can say for certain. But the images suggest that even in the earliest times, Sicilians sought meaning beyond survival. They reached for the sacred in the everyday. As centuries turned into millennia, new peoples arrived, each wave bringing change. The Sicans, thought to be the island's first true inhabitants, spread through the central highlands. Their villages were small, made of huts and surrounded by fields of barley and wheat. To them, Sicily was not an island, but a homeland, a place of ancestors and spirits, guarded by mountains and seas. Then came the cycles, arriving from the Italian peninsula around the 2nd millennium BCE, stronger and more warlike. They settled in the eastern valleys, where rivers cut through the fertile land. They brought new burial customs, new gods, and new tools of bronze. The clash between Sicans and Sicels was not only a battle for territory, but also the birth of a layered identity, an island already learning how to hold many peoples at once. The third group, the Elymians, made their homes in the west. Legend says they were refugees from Troy, survivors who fled the burning city and wandered across the Mediterranean until they found this triangular land. Whether myth or truth, their presence added another thread to the island's tapestry. They built towns like Segesta, with temples and theatres that would one day astonish travelers. By the dawn of the first millennium BCE, Sicily was no longer a wild land. It had become a crossroads of peoples, Sicans in the center, Sicels in the east, Elymians in the west. They farmed, traded, fought, and worshipped under the shadow of Mount Etna, whose eruptions reminded them that life was both fertile and fragile. Sicily's first footsteps echo with a paradox. It was both isolated and connected. Surrounded by sea, the island could have remained apart, yet the very sea that guarded it also carried new peoples to its shores. With each arrival, Sicily became less a single land and more a mosaic. Imagine, then, a shepherd standing on a ridge in those ancient times. Before him, the sun set into the Mediterranean, painting the water in gold. Behind him, the fields rustled with grain, and distant smoke rose from a village hearth. He would not know the names of Carthage or Rome or Byzantium. He would not foresee Normans or Spaniards. Yet he lived at the beginning of a story that would draw them all here. The first footsteps on Sicily's soil were light, but they set in motion the footsteps of armies, fleets, and civilizations that would never cease. By the early first millennium BCE, Sicily was already known far beyond its shores. Sailors whispered of its fertile valleys, its fish-filled waters, and its ports that could shelter fleets. For the seafarers of the Mediterranean, this island was not only a destination but also a stepping stone, a place to anchor between east and west. It was here that two of the most remarkable cultures of antiquity, the Phoenicians and the Greeks, came to stake their claims. The Phoenicians were merchants, born of the Levant, whose purple dyes and fine glass had already dazzled kingdoms. Their ships, slender and swift, slipped across the sea with ease. To them, Sicily was not a land to conquer, but a harbor for trade. They settled in the western corner of the island, in places like Motia, Panormus, later Palermo, and Saguntum. From these bases, they could exchange goods with local tribes, olive oil, salt, and grain, while guarding the sea routes that connected them to their great city of Carthage in North Africa. Unlike the Phoenicians, the Greeks came not as merchants alone, but as settlers, bearing with them the ambition to plant new city-states. By the 8th century BCE, ships from Corinth, Rhodes, and other polis set sail westward, seeking land for their growing populations. They found in Sicily a land rich with promise. Here they could cultivate vineyards, build temples, and extend their culture far beyond the Aegean. Their colonies took root quickly. Syracuse, founded by Corinthians in 734 BCE, grew into a city of marble streets and fortified walls. Agrigento, with its Valley of the Temples, boasted sanctuaries so grand that even centuries later, poets would write that the gods themselves might descend there. Gela, Selinunte, and Himera followed, each a beacon of Hellenic power on Sicilian soil. But this was no empty land. The Sicans, Cycles, and Elymians still held their territories, and the Phoenicians still guarded their harbors. The arrival of the Greeks did not erase these earlier peoples, but forced them into new roles: allies, rivals, or subjects. Sicily became a chessboard of cultures, each piece moving in competition, each move reshaping the balance of the island. The Greeks brought more than weapons and walls. They carried with them philosophy, art, and a way of life built upon the agora and the theatre. In Syracuse, plays were performed that echoed with laughter and tragedy. In Agrigento, philosophers pondered the nature of reality. Sicilian soil, once only farmed, now nurtured ideas. Yet alongside this flowering came conflict. The Greeks and Phoenicians eyed each other warily, their settlements pressing closer, their alliances drawing them into disputes. Carthage, the rising power of the Western Mediterranean, saw in Sicily both opportunity and threat. The stage was set for wars that would echo through centuries, wars not only between city-states but between empires. And still, amid the clash, daily life endured. Farmers tilled the black earth enriched by Etna's ash. Fishermen cast nets from rocky coves. Merchants haggled in crowded markets where one might hear Phoenician, Greek, and native tongues in the same breath. Children grew up among ruins older than their grandfathers, while priests lit fires to gods who bore names from many lands. By the time the classical world fully awoke to Sicily's importance, the island had already transformed. It was no longer simply a place at the edge of maps. It was the beating heart of the Mediterranean crossroads, where east met west, where merchant met settler, and where the story of Sicily began to burn with a brighter, more dangerous flame. For in the rising strength of Syracuse and the looming shadow of Carthage, the island's destiny was sealed. Sicily would never again be left to itself. It had become too valuable, too visible, too rich. And so, as the sun set over the Greek temples and the Phoenician harbors, Sicily entered a new age, an age of empires that would covet her soil, spill blood upon her fields, and raise monuments that even time would struggle to erase. By the 5th century BCE, Sicily had become more than a frontier of colonies. It was now the center of a fierce rivalry between two powers whose ambitions stretched across the Mediterranean: the Greek city of Syracuse in the east, and the Carthaginian Empire in the west. Carthage, the proud daughter of Phoenicia, had risen from a trading outpost into a vast dominion, controlling North Africa, Sardinia, and parts of Spain. For Carthage, Sicily was a natural extension of its sphere, a rich island that could provide grain for armies, timber for fleets, and ports for war galleys. The Punic merchants of Motia and Panormus were not only traders but also sentinels, guarding the approach of their empire. In the east, Syracuse stood as the greatest of the Greek colonies, founded by Corinthians but nourished by generations of settlers. It had become a jewel of Hellenic civilization. Its walls stretched wide, its harbors bustled with triremes, and its theaters echoed with the words of poets. To the Greeks, Syracuse was no colony anymore, but a polis to rival Athens itself. The clash between these two powers was inevitable. Sicily, triangular in shape, seemed almost to invite such a dual Carthaginian in the west, Greek in the east, and the center caught between their ambitions. Wars broke out in cycles, sometimes short, sometimes bitterly long. Armies marched across valleys where barley once swayed in the wind, and ships clashed in the narrow straits where dolphins once leapt. One figure came to embody Syracuse's defiance, Dionysius the Elder. Rising to power in the late 5th century BCE, he ruled with the authority of a tyrant, but also with the vision of a strategist. Under his command, Syracuse built walls so mighty they were said to be among the strongest in the Greek world. He raised armies of mercenaries, forged alliances, and even experimented with new weapons engines that hurled stones farther than any man had seen. Dionysius understood that survival on Sicily required more than courage. It required innovation. Carthage, in turn, answered with her own strength. From North Africa came generals and war elephants, their tusks gleaming with bronze, their feet shaking the Sicilian earth. Cities like Selinunte and Himera felt the wrath of Punic armies. Their temples toppled, their citizens enslaved. To stand between Syracuse and Carthage was to invite ruin. And yet, despite centuries of conflict, neither side could claim the island fully. Syracuse would win dazzling victories, only to falter in the next campaign. Carthage would sack cities, only to see them rebuilt under Greek banners. The wars carved scars into the land, but they also carved resilience into the people who lived there. Ordinary Sicilians endured the ebb and flow of these struggles. Farmers planted crops in the shadow of marching armies, praying that the season's harvest would not be trampled by soldiers. Fishermen kept their eyes on the horizon, wary of sails that might belong to friends one day, enemies the next. Life persisted, but it was a life lived on the edge of war. Amid the turmoil, Sicily remained a place of wonder. Travelers wrote of temples that gleamed against blue skies, of vineyards heavy with grapes, of festivals where Greek drama was performed even as Carthaginian fleets anchored offshore. The beauty of the island seemed almost cruel in contrast to the bloodshed upon its soil. By the dawn of the 4th century BCE, the rivalry of Carthage and Syracuse had turned Sicily into one of the most contested lands of the ancient world. Neither empire would relinquish its claim. For Carthage, Sicily was the gate to the east. For Syracuse, it was the shield of the west. The age of Carthage and Syracuse was not only a struggle for land, it was a struggle for identity. Would Sicily belong to the Punic world, with its merchant fleets and ancestral gods, or to the Greek world, with its theatres, temples, and philosophers? The answer, as so often in Sicilian history, was neither and both. For Sicily was not destined to be owned by one power. It was destined to absorb them all, to carry the memory of each, and to remind the world that crossroads are never conquered, only shared in cycles of rise and fall. By the 3rd century BCE, a new power was rising on the Italian peninsula, Rome. Once a city of farmers and soldiers, had expanded its reach across Latium, Etruria, and Campania. Ambition burned in its heart, and its legions marched with a discipline unknown to the older kingdoms of the Mediterranean. Inevitably, Rome's gaze turned southward, across the strait, to Sicily. For Rome, Sicily was more than an island. It was the granary of the Mediterranean, a land that could feed armies and enrich treasuries. For Carthage, it was the anchor of their Western Empire, a stepping stone that linked Africa, Sardinia, and Spain. Two worlds collided upon Sicilian soil, and their conflict would become legendary, the Punic Wars. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE, when rivalries among Sicilian cities drew Rome and Carthage into direct confrontation. The Romans, untested at sea, built a fleet almost overnight. They devised the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned sea battles into infantry fights, playing to the strength of their legions. Carthage, master of naval warfare, suddenly found itself challenged. For over 20 years, Sicily was battered by battles. Towns shifted allegiance. Fields lay barren, and families fled from one side to another, never certain who would rule them tomorrow. At last, in 241 BCE, Rome prevailed. Carthage's fleet was broken at the Battle of the Agates Islands, and Carthage was forced to cede Sicily. The island became Rome's first overseas province, a prize that marked the beginning of Roman dominion beyond Italy. For the Sicilians, it was the start of a new chapter, centuries under the eagle of Rome. Roman Sicily was both prosperous and burdened. Governors were dispatched to collect taxes and oversee order. But corruption was common. Grain flowed steadily from Sicilian fields to feed Rome's ever-growing population. The island became known as the breadbasket of the empire, its fertile soil harnessed for the ambitions of distant masters. Yet Sicily also gained from Rome's embrace. Roads were built, cities expanded, and Roman law brought a measure of stability after centuries of war. The ports of Syracuse, Messina, and Palermo bustled with trade, linking Sicily to every corner of the Mediterranean. Markets filled with goods from Gaul, Africa, and the East. The island's identity as a crossroads deepened. Still, the transition was not without resistance. Sicilian slaves, many of them captives from foreign wars, toiled in fields and mines. In the 2nd century BCE, their suffering sparked uprisings, the Servile Wars, when tens of thousands of slaves rose against their Roman masters. For a time, the rebels carved out kingdoms of their own, defying legions before being crushed. These revolts scarred the land and reminded Rome that even a province rich in grain could also be rich in discontent. Amid the struggles, Sicily retained its cultural wealth. Greek theatres still hosted plays, temples still rose to gods, both old and new. Roman settlers brought Latin tongue and customs, but they did not erase what had come before. Instead, as always, Sicily absorbed Punic shrines beside Greek columns. Roman arches over Sicily foundations. Perhaps no moment better symbolized this blend than the fate of Syracuse during the Second Punic War. In 212 BCE, Rome besieged the city. Then, under the influence of Carthage, Syracuse resisted fiercely, aided by the genius of Archimedes, whose machines hurled stones and set fire to ships. But even Archimedes could not hold back Rome forever. The city fell, its treasures plundered, its great thinker slain despite orders to spare him. Syracuse, once the pride of Greek Sicily, became another jewel in Rome's crown. For centuries thereafter, Sicily remained a province of the Roman world. Soldiers garrisoned its towns, merchants filled its harbors, and grain ships sailed endlessly to Rome. The island's destiny was now tied to the fate of the Republic, and later the Empire. When Rome flourished, Sicily prospered. When Rome trembled, Sicily felt the quake. The conquest of Sicily was more than a military victory. It marked a turning point in world history. Rome had taken its first step beyond Italy, and it would not stop. The empire that would one day encircle the Mediterranean began with this island, this triangle of land where so many others had fought and fallen. For the Sicilians, the eagle of Rome cast a long shadow, but as always, beneath that shadow, they endured. Farmers sowed grain, fishermen cast nets, children learned the Latin tongue, and temples echoed with prayers in many languages. Sicily was Roman, yet never only Roman. As centuries passed beneath the Roman eagle, Sicily remained faithful to its role, the breadbasket of the empire, a link across seas, a province both valued and vulnerable. Yet Rome itself was not eternal. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, cracks spread through the empire like fractures in marble. Enemies pressed at the borders. Civil wars drained strength, and the unity that had once made Rome invincible began to wither. Sicily, as always, felt the tremors of greater events. When the Western Roman Empire staggered toward collapse, the island's fate shifted with every tide of conquest. First came the Vandals, storming out of North Africa under their king, Gaiseric. In 440 CE, their fleets crossed the Mediterranean and descended upon Sicilian shores. Farmers fled their fields, and the ports, once filled with grain ships to Rome, now filled with sails of raiders. For a generation, the Vandals used Sicily as a base to strike deeper into Italy, a reminder that the seas which brought trade could also deliver ruin. The Vandals did not stay forever. Their empire stretched too far. Their strength spread too thin. Soon the island was claimed by another successor of Rome, the Ostrogoths. Under the leadership of Theodoric the Great, Sicily became part of the Gothic kingdom that controlled Italy. The Ostrogoths brought a measure of stability, blending Roman administration with Gothic rule. Laws were enforced, fields replanted, and for a moment, Sicily breathed again. Yet the memory of Rome lingered, and in the Eastern Empire Byzantium, the dream of reconquest burned bright. The Emperor Justinian, ruling from Constantinople in the 6th century, sought to restore the glory of Rome. His general Belisarius, brilliant and determined, sailed across the Mediterranean. Sicily was his first stepping stone. In 535 CE, the Byzantine armies landed, and within a year, the Ostrogoths were driven from the island. Once more, Sicily changed masters. Under Byzantine rule, it was tied to the Eastern Empire. Its administration centered in Syracuse, which became the capital of the theme of Sicily. Greek was reintroduced as the language of governance. Churches were rebuilt in the style of Constantinople, their domes glittering with mosaics. Monks from the East carried icons and chants that mingled with older traditions, giving Sicily yet another layer of identity. But Byzantine rule was not always gentle. Heavy taxation weighed on the farmers who worked the fertile plains. Imperial officials, distant from the realities of Sicilian life, sometimes exploited the province. Rebellions stirred, and loyalties shifted. The island was once again caught between its own people and the ambitions of foreign powers. Through these centuries of turmoil, Sicilians endured. Vineyards were tended, olive groves nurtured, and markets filled with voices in Latin, Greek, and the fading tongues of earlier peoples. The island was less a single nation than a mirror of the Mediterranean itself, fractured, diverse, yet bound together by trade, faith, and survival. The Byzantine centuries gave Sicily new strength and new vulnerability. Its position made it both a jewel of the empire and a target for those who sought to challenge Constantinople's might. Vandals, Goths, and Byzantines had all left their imprint, but none could fully erase what came before. The island's story was becoming less about who ruled it, and more about how it absorbed and transformed each ruler's legacy. As the 7th and 8th centuries dawned, new horizons appeared. Across the southern seas, in Arabia, a faith was rising that would soon send armies and fleets into the Mediterranean. For Sicily, the winds were shifting again. Soon, sails bearing crescents would appear on the horizon, and a new chapter would begin, one that would transform the island with fire, trade, and faith. In the 9th century, the calm waters around Sicily once again darkened with sails. This time, they belonged to warriors and traders of a new faith, Islam. From the deserts of Arabia, Islam had spread across North Africa and into Spain, creating a world that stretched from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. For the rulers of Ifriqiya, based in modern Tunisia, Sicily was both a target of conquest and a jewel to be claimed. In 827 CE, a Muslim fleet set sail across the strait. On board were soldiers, horses, and commanders driven by faith and ambition. They landed near Mazara on Sicily's southern coast, beginning what would be a century-long struggle. City by city, fortress by fortress, the Arabs pressed forward. Some Sicilian towns resisted fiercely. Others opened their gates, weary of Byzantine taxes and promises left unkept. The conquest was not swift, but it was relentless. By 902, Palermo had become the capital of the new emirate of Sicily. Under Arab rule, the city blossomed. Once a quiet harbor, Palermo was transformed into one of the greatest cities of the Mediterranean. Palaces rose with gardens irrigated by ingenious canals. Markets overflowed with spices, silk, sugar, and citrus fruits unknown to earlier generations. The call to prayer echoed from minarets, blending with the voices of merchants from Africa, the Levant, and Europe. The Arabs brought more than armies, they brought knowledge. They introduced advanced irrigation systems, allowing farmers to harness the island's rich soil more effectively. Oranges, lemons, and sugarcane took root, turning Sicily into a garden. New techniques in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine filtered in through scholars who studied in Arabic and translated texts from Greek and Latin. The island, once battered by war, now pulsed with intellectual energy. Yet Sicily under the emirate was not only Islamic. Christians and Jews remained, their communities protected under the system of dhimma, paying special taxes but allowed to practice their faiths. The island became a mosaic of cultures more intricate than ever before. Churches stood beside mosques, and synagogues thrived in neighborhoods where many languages were spoken. Sicily did not erase differences, it layered them, creating a society both fragile and vibrant. Still, the emirate was not free of conflict. Rival dynasties struggled for control, and rebellions flared. The Byzantines attempted counterattacks, though rarely with success. In the mountains and remote valleys, some Sicilian communities resisted Islamization, clinging to older ways. The island, as always, was both unified and divided. To an ordinary Sicilian farmer in the 10th century, life was a blend of continuity and change. The plough still turned the earth, sheep still grazed on hillsides, and families still gathered at hearths in the evening. But around him, the world had shifted. Arabic words slipped into the local tongue. Exotic fruits sweetened the table. Taxes were collected by new officials. Prayers spoken in new melodies. The rhythm of life was familiar, but the color of life had deepened. Travelers from afar marveled at what they saw. Geographers praised Sicily as a pearl of the seas, a place where knowledge, trade, and beauty converged. Palermo's splendor revealed Cairo and Cordoba. The island that once suffered under endless wars was, for a time, a beacon of prosperity. But prosperity also drew envy. To the north, a new power was rising: the Normans. Warriors from France who had carved a kingdom in southern Italy. They watched Sicily with hungry eyes. Just as the Arabs had supplanted the Byzantines, so too would the Normans dream of supplanting the Arabs. The cycle of conquest had not ended, it had only paused. For now, however, the Arab age in Sicily marked a flowering unlike any before. It was a chapter of gardens and scholars, of merchants and minarets, of diversity, both celebrated and contested. Like every age on the island, it would not last forever, but it would leave behind oranges, words, and memories that still cling to Sicily's air today. By the 11th century, the island of Sicily had already been shaped by Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, and Arabs. Yet a new wave of conquerors was about to land upon its shores, the Normans, born of Viking stock, hardened in the fields of northern France, and sharpened by years of mercenary service in southern Italy. The Normans were ambitious warriors who saw Sicily as the jewel that could crown their rising power. The conquest began in 1061, when Roger de Hauteville, younger brother of Robert Guiscard, led a small force across the Strait of Messina. Their landing was modest, but their vision was vast. For decades, the Normans fought town by town, fortress by fortress, against the Arab rulers of the island. It was a slow struggle, marked by sieges, shifting alliances, an act of both cruelty and pragmatism. By 1091, the conquest was complete. Palermo, the great Arab capital, fell to the Normans, and with it, Sicily entered a new age. But unlike other conquerors, the Normans did not seek to erase what they found. Instead, they blended. Roger the, and later his son Roger II, recognized the brilliance of Arab administration, the wisdom of Greek scholars, and the traditions of Latin Christianity. Under their rule, Sicily became something extraordinary, a kingdom where cultures fused into a harmony rare in the medieval world. Roger II, crowned king in 1130, embodied this vision. His court in Palermo glittered with diversity. Arab architects built palaces adorned with muqarnas, ceilings, and gardens irrigated by canals first dug under the emirate. Greek scribes copied ancient manuscripts, ensuring that classical knowledge survived. Latin bishops presided over cathedrals, their bells ringing alongside the call to prayer that still echoed in neighborhoods of the city. The result was what historians call Golden Sicily. Nowhere else in Europe could one find such a mosaic. Norman knights, Arab poets, Greek monks, and Jewish merchants living under the same crown. Palermo rivaled Constantinople and Cordoba as a center of art and learning. Travelers marveled at the Palatine Chapel, where golden mosaics of Christ, Pantocrator, shone above arches carved with Arabic inscriptions, a vision of coexistence turned into stone and glass. This flourishing did not mean peace was perfect. Tensions simmered, rebellions flared, and Norman authority was sometimes challenged. Yet the very survival of such a cosmopolitan kingdom in an age of crusades and holy wars was remarkable. In Sicily, Latin Christians could employ Muslim administrators, and Norman kings could dress in robes woven with Arabic script. It was not tolerance in the modern sense, but it was coexistence shaped by necessity and vision. For ordinary Sicilians, life under the Normans meant continuity with change. Farmers benefited from stable rule and from agricultural systems preserved from Arab times, citrus groves, olive orchards, and wheat fields flourished. Markets bustled with goods from Africa and Europe, linking Sicilian towns to the wider world. Artisans carved ivory, wove silk, and cast bronze. Their craft supported by royal patronage, the Kingdom of Sicily became a crossroads not only of trade, but also of ideas. Arabic treatises on medicine and astronomy were translated into Latin. Greek philosophies once lost to the West resurfaced here, carried into Europe by Sicilian scholars. The island that had so often been torn apart by conflict now offered a bridge between civilizations, but golden ages are fragile. After Roger II's death, the kingdom faced succession struggles and the ambitions of foreign dynasties. The Normans, though brilliant conquerors, were few in number. Their survival depended on alliances and careful governance. As centuries passed, new powers, the Germans of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, then the French Angevins, and later the Spanish Aragonese would covet Sicily's throne. Still, the legacy of the Normans endured. They had taken an island of fragments and, for a brief, shining moment, forged it into a unified kingdom renowned across Europe and the Mediterranean. Their chapels, palaces, and cathedrals still stand today, glittering reminders of a time when Sicily was not just a prize, but a beacon. The Normans had come as conquerors. They left as builders of a kingdom whose light would echo long after their dynasty faded. The Norman kingdom of Sicily had dazzled the medieval world with its golden mosaics and multicultural harmony. But dynasties are fragile. After Roger II's successors faltered, the crown of Sicily passed into the hands of new rulers, each foreign, each ambitious, each leaving their mark upon the island. In the late 12th century, the German Hohenstaufen dynasty inherited Sicily through marriage. Henry VI, Holy Roman Emperor, wed Constance, the daughter of Roger II, binding Sicily to the empire. Their son, Frederick II, would become one of the most remarkable monarchs in European history, crowned King of Sicily at just 3 years old. Frederick grew up amid the island's blend of cultures. He absorbed Greek philosophy, Arab science, Latin law, and Jewish scholarship. By the time he became Holy Roman Emperor in 1220, he was celebrated as Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world. His court in Palermo revived the brilliance of the Norman age. Scholars debated astronomy under mosaic ceilings. Poets composed in the Sicilian dialect that would influence Italian literature. And architects raised castles like Castel del Monte, blending Eastern and Western styles. Yet Frederick's ambitions also drew Sicily into wider storms. His conflicts with the papacy made the island a battlefield of politics and faith. After his death in 1250, the Hohenstaufen dynasty faltered, and Sicily became a prize fought over by popes and kings. The papacy invited the French Angevins, led by Charles of Anjou, to claim the throne. In 1266, Charles defeated the Hohenstaufen at the Battle of Benevento, seizing control for the Sicilians. However, Angevin rule brought resentment, heavy taxes, foreign officials, and disdain for local traditions bred bitterness. Tension simmered until, on Easter Monday of 1282, it exploded. That evening, in Palermo, as bells rang for Vespers, an uprising broke out. The Sicilian Vespers, as it came to be known, spread like wildfire. French soldiers were slain in streets and alleys within weeks. The entire island had rebelled against Angevin rule. It was one of the most dramatic popular revolts of the Middle Ages, a cry of defiance that echoed far beyond Sicily's shores. Seeking aid, the rebels invited Peter III of Aragon to claim the crown. The Aragonese accepted, and soon Sicily became part of the Crown of Aragon, linking it to Spain's rising power. The Angevins retreated to the mainland, ruling what became known as the Kingdom of Naples, while Sicily remained under Aragonese kings. Under Aragonese rule, the island entered a new era of connection to Iberia. Palermo remained important, but Barcelona and Valencia grew into dominant partners. Spanish officials governed alongside local elites, and the rhythms of life adapted once again. The Aragonese brought stability, but also tied Sicily's fate to the fortunes of Spain. For ordinary Sicilians, the centuries of Hohenstaufen, Angevin, and Aragonese rule were a mixture of brilliance and burden. Frederick II's age had been one of learning and innovation, but it was followed by crushing wars. The Vespers brought pride in rebellion, but also decades of struggle between French and Spanish powers. Markets still bustled, fields still bore grain, and fishermen still cast nets, yet always under new banners, new taxes, new rulers. Through it all, Sicily's identity deepened. Each dynasty left its mark: German castles, or French fortifications, Spanish churches. Each tried to rule, but none erased the others. The island remained what it had always been: a mosaic. By the end of the Middle Ages, Sicily was firmly bound to Spain, its destiny tied to Iberian ambitions in the wider Mediterranean. The island's people, however, carried in their language, customs, and memory the layers of Greeks, Arabs, Normans, Germans, and more. It was a heritage both heavy and rich, the legacy of living at the crossroads of empires. With the Aragonese firmly established after the Sicilian Vespers, Sicily entered a new chapter tied to the fate of Spain. By the late 15th century, the crowns of Aragon and Castile united under Ferdinand and Isabella, creating the foundation of a Spanish empire that stretched across Europe and the oceans. Sicily, long a crossroads, was now a cornerstone in one of the greatest powers of the age. Under Spanish rule, the island's role was primarily strategic. It was a bastion against Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean, a fortress protecting the routes between Spain and its Italian possessions. The great port of Messina, overlooking the strait, became a naval stronghold. Palermo served as the administrative capital, seat of the Spanish viceroys. Castles were reinforced, fleets stationed, and soldiers quartered. Sicily was no longer just the breadbasket of empires, it was also their shield. The Habsburg dynasty, inheriting Spain in the 16th century, tied Sicily's fate even tighter to European geopolitics. Under Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, the island became part of a global empire that spanned from the Americas to the Philippines. For Sicilians, this meant both pride and burden. Their island was a critical link in imperial defense, but also a province far removed from the concerns of Madrid and Vienna. Economically, Sicily remained fertile, exporting grain, citrus, and wine. Yet heavy taxation drained wealth to support wars fought faraway wars against France, the Ottomans, and Protestant rebels in northern Europe. The burden fell on peasants and small landholders who struggled under feudal obligations and the demands of Spanish officials. Wealth concentrated in the hands of nobles and clergy, while villages endured poverty. Culturally, however, Sicily flourished in its own way. Spanish influence brought Baroque art and architecture, filling Palermo, Catania, and Syracuse with ornate churches and palaces. Jesuit schools spread learning, while poets and chroniclers recorded the island's layered history. The Sicilian dialect absorbed Spanish words, adding yet another layer to its mosaic tongue. Festivals blended Catholic ritual with local tradition, creating vibrant displays of devotion and identity. But life under the Spanish crown was not without unrest. Pirate raids from North Africa threatened coastal towns. Disease, famine, and earthquakes tested resilience. In 1647, rebellion erupted in Palermo, fueled by anger at food shortages and oppressive taxation, though quickly suppressed. It revealed the simmering discontent beneath Spanish authority. The 17th century brought further trials. The great eruption of Mount Etna in 1669 devastated Catania, burying parts of the city in lava. Just 2 decades later, the earthquake of 1693 destroyed entire towns in southeastern Sicily, killing tens of thousands. Yet, from this destruction arose a new architectural splendor, the Sicilian Baroque. Towns like Noto, Ragusa, and Modica were rebuilt with sweeping staircases, curving facades, and golden stone that glowed in the sun. Out of ruin, Sicily once again transformed. As the War of the Spanish Succession swept across Europe in the early 18th century, Sicily was traded like a chess piece. For a brief period, it passed to the Savoy dynasty, then to the Austrian Habsburgs, before finally returning to the Bourbon branch of the Spanish crown. Each new ruler brought fresh officials and new banners. But for ordinary Sicilians, life remained much the same. The fields to plough, the nets to cast, the festivals to celebrate, the taxes to endure. By the time the Spanish Habsburg era closed, Sicily had been woven deeply into the history of Catholic Europe. It was a frontier against Islam, a jewel of Baroque culture, a province of an empire that claimed the world. Yet, beneath the layers of Spanish rule, Sicilians retained their stubborn independence of spirit, their memory of past conquerors, and their sense that their island was always more than the domain of kings. For Sicily's destiny was never only to serve an empire. It was to outlast them, to absorb their monuments, their words, their faiths, and to wait for the next tide of history that would surely come. By the 18th century, Sicily had passed from hand to hand like a prize in Europe's dynastic struggles. After brief periods under Savoy and Austrian rule, the island returned to the Bourbon dynasty of Spain, whose Neapolitan branch ruled both Naples and Sicily as the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. For a time, Palermo and Naples shared a fragile partnership, but the balance of power leaned heavily toward the mainland. Sicily, though rich in history and fertile in soil, was treated as a province rather than an equal kingdom. The Bourbon rulers imposed order, but also burdened the island with corruption, feudalism, and neglect. Noble estates grew ever larger, while peasants tilled the land under oppressive conditions. Grain was exported to feed distant markets. Even as villages endured hunger, the sense that Sicily was exploited by outsiders, even those who ruled in its name, deepened. Yet the island was not silent. The Enlightenment, sweeping through Europe, reached Sicilian shores in 1812 amid the Napoleonic Wars. Sicily briefly experimented with constitutional government. The old feudal structures were challenged, and a parliament met in Palermo. For a moment, Sicilians glimpsed the possibility of self-rule, of liberty balanced with tradition. But the dream proved short-lived. With Napoleon's defeat, Bourbon authority was restored, and the constitution was swept away. Throughout the 19th century, waves of rebellion rolled across Sicily. In 1820 and again in 1848, uprisings erupted in Palermo and spread across the island. The rebels demanded independence, reform, and freedom from Bourbon misrule. Barricades rose in narrow streets. Cannons thundered from hilltop fortresses. And for a time, Sicilian patriots held their own, but each revolt was crushed, often with brutal force. The spirit of resistance, however, refused to die. It was in this atmosphere of discontent that Sicily became a stage for the Risorgimento, the movement for Italian unification. In 1860, Giuseppe Garibaldi landed with his 1,000, a band of red-shirted volunteers, on the western coast at Marsala. The people, weary of Bourbon rule, flocked to his cause. Peasants, artisans, and intellectuals joined the march. City after city opened its gates, and within weeks, Palermo was ablaze with revolution. The Bourbon armies faltered, their will broken by both Garibaldi's audacity and popular support for change. Battles were fought in streets and fields, but the momentum belonged to the revolutionaries. By late summer, the Bourbons had retreated, and Garibaldi handed Sicily not to himself, but to King Victor Emmanuel II of Piedmont, Sardinia, paving the way for the creation of the Kingdom of Italy. For Sicily, unification was both triumph and disappointment. The dream of throwing off foreign masters was realized, but the new Italian state soon revealed its own distance from the island's needs. Promises of reform gave way to heavy taxes and military conscription. The gap between North and South widened, and many Sicilians felt that unification had merely exchanged one set of rulers for another. Economic hardship drove waves of emigration. Families left their ancestral villages to seek new lives in America, Argentina, and beyond. Those who remained struggled under poverty and injustice, conditions that gave rise to secret societies and, eventually, the shadowy power of the mafia. Sicily, so often a crossroads of empires, now found itself marginalized within its own nation. And yet, even in disillusionment, Sicilians held fast to pride. They had risen against Bourbons, welcomed Garibaldi, and joined the making of Italy. Their language, traditions, and resilience endured. Cathedrals still gleamed in sunlight. Markets still rang with voices. And the land still bore wheat, citrus, and olives as it had for millennia. The age of revolution and unification left Sicily with scars and with hope. It was no longer an island ruled by distant kings or foreign dynasties. It was part of a nation still struggling to understand the richness and complexity of its southern jewel. The story of Sicily had entered the modern age, but its ancient rhythms, conquest, endurance, renewal remained the same. The story of Sicily is not a straight line but a spiral, circling through ages of conquest, loss, and renewal, from the first shepherds who painted in caves to the Greeks who raised marble temples, from the Carthaginians and Romans who fought for its fields, to the Arabs who made it a garden of citrus and scholars, from the Normans who crowned it a golden kingdom, to the Spaniards, Bourbons, and finally the Italians. Each left their mark. Each became a thread in the tapestry. Sicily was never only Greek, never only Arab, never only Norman or Spanish. It was always all of them at once. Its cathedrals still glow with golden mosaics where Latin saints stand beneath Arabic arches. Its markets still sell fruits first planted by Muslim farmers. Its villages still carry words shaped by centuries of many tongues. The island itself remembers, even when empires have forgotten. For the Sicilian people, survival has been more than endurance, it has been transformation. They absorbed the blows of war, the weight of empire, the disappointment of promises broken, and turned them into culture, into resilience, into song. The fisherman on the coast of Palermo, the farmer in the shadow of Etna, the child running through narrow streets of Ragusa, each carries the inheritance of millennia. Often without knowing it, to fall asleep to the history of Sicily is to drift through the memory of the Mediterranean itself. The island is not just land surrounded by sea, it is crossroads, mirror, and witness. It reminds us that no empire lasts forever, but the people of the crossroads endure, weaving fragments into a mosaic more enduring than stone. And so, as the night deepens and the voices of history soften, imagine the waves lapping at Sicilian shores. They have carried Phoenician traders, Greek settlers, Carthaginian galleys, Roman fleets, Arab dhows, Norman knights, and Spanish armadas. Tonight, they carry only the moonlight, silver and gentle, a lullaby over the waters. Close your eyes, the empires are gone, but the island remains. Sicily, eternal mosaic of the sea, whispers its story still to those who listen and to those who dream.